Good morning, students. Welcome to the revision video class of Standard 10, subject English. Today we are going to start with the revision class for your online examination of English subject. Let's start with the revision of chapter number 1 from the book Footprints Without Feet, that is, A Triumph of Surgery, written by James Herriot. Let's start with the title of the story, children. The story, A Triumph of Surgery, narrates the episode where the narrator, a veterinary surgeon, saves the life of a dull dog Tricky by hospitalizing him to prevent him from being overfed by his wealthy owner, Mrs. Pomfrey, who was only worsening his condition. Who is I in this story? I refers to the narrator, Mr. James Herriot, a veterinary surgeon and a doctor. Now let's see the theme of the story. The story, A Triumph of Surgery, is about a dog named Tricky. The theme of the story is about the blind love which we possess for the one whom we love the most. Mrs. Pomfrey had no idea that her blind and extreme love for her dog Tricky took him to trouble. Characters from the story are James Herriot, a veterinary surgeon who proves to be a capable doctor, Mrs. Pomfrey, a wealthy single woman, and Tricky, a lazy fat dog. Now let's have a quick view over the summary of the lesson. This story has been written by James Herriot. The subject of this story is a pet dog which is spoilt by its owner, Mrs. Pomfrey. The owner indulges her dog so much with food and other comforts that the dog has become overweight and cannot even walk properly. Finally, the dog has been taken to a veterinary doctor who treats the dog without using a single medicine. The dog is left with all other dogs so that it can play and get the much needed physical exercise. After a period of enough physical activities, the dog loses much of its fat and becomes hale and hearty. Apparently, this is a simple story with simple subject. But if we try to read between the words, the story has much significance for our life as well. You will see many kids who are overweight and spoilt because their parents just try to meet every demand of the kid. The kid develops into a couch potato, which is not good for his life. So the moral of the story is The Triumph of Surgery, written by James Herriot, where author learnt us not to spoil anyone by giving too much things. In this story, a man had a dog and the owner loved his dog very much. He gave everything to his dog. That's why author has given us a message to give a simple life to every children. Now, something very, very important for you to understand, my dear students. In your online examination, children, you will get the question this way. I have presented before you the blueprint of the question paper. Your question paper will be MCQ, children, multiple choice questions. For example, what was the name of Mrs. Pomfrey's dog? You will get 4 options there: Ben, Tommy, Tricky, Johnny. Maybe some other options. And you will have to click on the right answer. For example, Mrs. Pomfrey is a fabulously rich and resourceful lady with her large number of servants and maids. She is passionately attached to her little pet dog named Tricky. So the correct answer is, children, Tricky. So you will click on Tricky. I have ticked, but you have to click there. Now some important points to remember, children, for your exams. All questions will be asked in the same manner. One has to be quick in answering the questions as certain time limit is fixed for each question. Maybe 20 seconds, 30 seconds, 40, etc. But the time limit will not be too long. Read the questions properly and then answer. Once you click on the answer and the next question appears, You cannot go back on the previous answer to correct it or make any changes. Kindly remember that this online test marks will be added to your final exams. All further details will be provided to you by the school management soon, children. So have patience and wait. You will get everything in detail about the online exam. Now, I have brought before you today some of the important questions, short questions that will help you to have a detailed and thorough study of the chapter line by line, children. Number 1. Who was Mrs. Pumphrey worried about? She was worried about Tricky because it has become very fat. Why does Tricky fall ill? Because he can never say no to food and his owner, Mrs. Pumphrey, would constantly feed him all kinds of food items that let Tricky become overweight. How did Tricky look? Tricky had become very fat. He looked like a blotted sausage. His eyes were red and rheumy. When Tricky was ill, who did Mrs. Pumphrey make a frantic call? She had to make a call to Dr. Harriet, a veterinary surgeon, to cure her dog. How did Mrs. Pumphrey and her servant behave when Tricky was being sent to the surgery? The entire staff was roused. Maids rushed in and out bringing his bed, cushion, toys, etc. Everybody was in tears. Mrs. Pumphrey gave a desperate cry. Who was responsible for the dog's illness? Mrs. Pumphrey. What was Tricky's ailment? Mrs. Pumphrey gave Tricky extra between meals, that is malt, cod liver oil, etc. He was not given any physical exercise, so the dog fell ill and started vomiting. Why was the narrator shocked at Tricky's appearance? This question may also come this way, children. Why was Dr. Harriet worried about Tricky? He was worried about Tricky because the latter was overweight and unable to walk. He was given extra food by its owner. He was hardly given any exercise. His tongue lolled from his jaws. He had become hugely fat, like a blotted sausage with a leg at each corner. The household dogs at the surgery rejected Tricky as an uninteresting object. Why? At the surgery, the household dogs surrounded Tricky, sniffed him, but Tricky looked at them with dull eyes, did not give any response, so they found him uninteresting. Describe the small dog Tricky. Lazy, overfed by the owner, looked like a blotted sausage, become hugely fat, and he had red and rheumy eyes. Describe Mrs. Pumphrey. Rich woman, silly, behaved thoughtless by over-pampering Tricky, indirectly responsible for Tricky's ailment, wasted money. What was the real disease that Tricky was suffering from? Actually, Tricky was suffering from a vomiting problem because of overfeeding. What suggestions were given by Dr. Harriet to Mrs. Pumphrey at the initial stage? He suggested her to cut down on the sweet things and not to give extra food to him. He also suggested her to give him more exercises and keep him on a very strict diet. Why was Dr. Harriet confident that Tricky will be in hospital soon? Because he was shocked to see Tricky's fatty condition. In the end of the lesson, Mrs. Pumphrey says, "This is a triumph of surgery." Why? Mrs. Pumphrey's dog, Tricky, had fallen ill and had to admitted for treatment to Dr. Harriet's hospital. Dr. Harriet gave him a lot of water and exercise, which helped Tricky to recover. When Mrs. Pumphrey went to collect him, seeing him fully recovered, she called it a triumph of surgery. So children, I have tried my best to cover up all the important questions from this chapter to discuss before you orally. Now, here I have presented before you some of the questions that you need to practice at home orally for your self-assessment. Just check whether you are able to answer these questions or not. If means you have been in a thorough study of this chapter and ready for the online exam. Why was Mr. Harriet tempted to keep Tricky as a permanent guest? Where did Mr. Harriet take Tricky? What did the doctor give Tricky at his clinic? How did the gang of the household dogs accept Tricky as their member? How did Tricky treat his mistress when she went to collect him? So these are some of the important questions, children. I'm not giving you any home assignment in the written form because you need to revise the chapter thoroughly. So read the chapter carefully, answer these questions orally, and follow all the answers that I have given you today in the revision lecture. Thank you. If you have any doubt, you can ask me anytime.